All right, well, hello everybody and welcome. Hanging out, I got Elon and Ian Dahl with our Starlink team. Figured we'd check in. It's been, typical SpaceX year. Launched a brand new vehicle, acquired XAI, now SpaceX AI, announced a Terra-sized chip building project, and so
never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. Typical year. And so let's kind of wanted to connect some of the dots on how this all feeds into making life multiplanetary, starting to climb up the Kardashev scale, maybe show off some cool new AI sat stuff. Let's kind of start galaxy sized and bring people in with the Kardashev scale.
What's the big picture?
What's the big picture? What is the Kardashev scale?
Like, how do you decide what progress the civilization has made? That's the most objective metric that any alien species, say, visiting us, would calibrate how much progress we've made as a civilization. And one of the most objective ways to do that is the amount of power that any given civilization has been able to harness. There was a Russian physicist, actually, by the name of Kardashev, who thought about this, and I think it's a good way to characterize it, which is you can assess how well a civilization is harnessing the power available on the planet. That's type 1. And then type 2 would be how much of the stars' power are you harnessing? And then type 3 would be how much of the galaxy's power are you harnessing? These are very objective and measurable numbers. So right now we're very low on the Kardashev 1 scale. Like if you say, like, what proportion of our planet's power are we harnessing? It's a very, very tiny number. And basically we're harnessing almost nothing of our star's power. So the sun is truly an immense thing. It is difficult with words to characterize just how immense the sun is, but this gives you sort of a sense of scale.
Yeah, it's a big difficulty jump going from level 1 to level 2.
Very big difficulty jump, yes. And level 3, and we don't even know how to do level 3, really.
We'll get there.
Yeah, exactly. AI will figure it out, I suppose. One way to appreciate the size of the sun is to think about how heavy is the sun compared to all the rest of the mass in the solar system. So the sun is about 99.86% of all mass in the solar system. It's everything, and then of the remaining 0.14%, most of that is Jupiter, one planet.
So we're still lightweight.
Yes. The entire mass of Earth is in the tiny miscellaneous category. We're like Earth is a tiny dust mote compared to the sun.
Well, but how much energy are we talking? Like, coming from the sun, especially compared to what we're using here on Earth? Because it feels like...
Yeah. The incident solar energy on the cross-section of the Earth is roughly a half billionth of the sun's power output. And the vast majority of that we cannot use because 70% of Earth is water. Yeah. Technically, our planet should be called water because it is 70% water, and I think an alien civilization visiting us would be like, why are they calling it Earth when it is mostly water?
We're the Greenland's not green of the solar system.
Yeah, a bunch of exactly even we're 70% water, and then of the 30% that's land, a bunch of it is Antarctica or Siberia type of thing. Very northern Canada type of thing. Very difficult to not places people typically want to live, and you're not going to get a lot of solar power at the poles. So the actual usable area of land where you can get solar power is quite small. Anyway, in order to ascend the Kardashev scale, or in order to get to any meaningful percentage of the sun's energy harnessed, you have to go to space. If you wanted to get to, say, a millionth of the power output of the sun, you would have to increase civilizational energy harnessed by much more than 1 million. So we currently use much less than a trillionth of the power output of the sun. And a trillion is a million times a million. So basically we're basically practically nowhere on the sort of the Kardashev 2 scale, practically nowhere.
So on Kardashev scale, we're still
non-existent.
We're
not
non-existent.
registered. We're like not even. Yeah. We're not registering.
Not even a microsol.
Yeah.
No.
And so to actually...
One microsol would be an epic achievement relative to where we are right now.
Something to aspire to.
Yeah, that's our goal. And this is, I think, both simultaneously an incredibly adventurous goal relative to where we are, and yet not particularly adventurous as a percentage of the sun's energy to try to achieve power harness being 1/1,000,000th of what the sun outputs.
And so to actually start...
A microsol. Yeah.
To actually start getting there, though, we're not just going to throw solar arrays in space, try to soak up a bunch of the sun. Like, there has to be a need. Like, you want to go up there and do something meaningful. And obviously, until this point in human history, like, there hasn't really been a need. What has changed to make us think that, like, maybe now's the time to start trying to notch a percentage point or two?
I mean, getting to 1% of the sun's energy?
Maybe not a percent. Let's go, like, we'll move the decimal point back.
So you're an extremely kick-ass civilization if you get to 1% of the sun's energy. And I'm like, wow, that civilization is going to be vastly more powerful than us, to say the least.
Yeah.
So in order to start to make some progress on the Kardashev scale, we need to launch satellites to orbit Earth and capture solar power. And that avoids the need to build massive power plants on Earth and deal with cooling, because cooling is actually much easier in space than it is on Earth. You can just radiate to the vacuum. And so what we're proposing here and what we intend to do is to try to climb the Kardashev scale to, be kind of like a respectable civilization. So when the aliens, hopefully there are aliens out there, and they maybe finally decide to talk to us, where we have some respectable amount of the sun's energy being used.
Yeah.
That's not like totally pathetic, which is the current situation.
And so before we start sending data centers, sending all of this to space, there are some limiting factors that we got to get through that would traditionally make it so, like, this is almost impossible.
Yeah, what does it take to scale?
Yeah.
So things it takes to scale are you need to have a large mass to orbit capability, which is what Starship will give us. That large mass, so you ultimately need to send millions of tons to orbit and beyond. And you need the power associated with that. So if you want to put 100 gigawatts or ultimately a terawatt into space from Earth, you will at some point need a terawatt of solar. And then you're going to need a terawatt of AI chips. So the three things you need are mass to orbit, a lot of solar power, and radiators, of course, and a lot of chips.
All right, well, let's start ticking down the list. So mass to orbit, that's where Starship comes in.
Yeah.
We just had first flight of V3. It was awesome. I know you were there. It was crazy to see that rocket launch.
Yeah.
And like long time coming. What's Starship's kind of purpose of being? What is it going to be doing?
Yeah, so Starship is going to revolutionize space, really. It's the first rocket design that is capable of full and rapid reusability. Now, reusability is the fundamental breakthrough that is necessary to make life multiplanetary, as well as to ascend the Kardashev scale. You simply cannot ascend the Kardashev scale unless you have a reusable spacecraft, and you cannot extend life to the moon, to Mars, and to the rest of the solar system without a reusable rocket. The cost is simply prohibitive. You can't make enough rockets.
Yeah.
Unless you can refly them. Just like any other mode of transport, you can imagine that if we had to throw away airplanes every time we flew, flying would be far too expensive, and basically no one would be flying airplanes.
You're doing a whole lot more driving.
Rapid reusability.
Yes. Every mode of transport is reusable, without which is simply not viable as a transport system. So cars, planes, boats, horses, bicycles are all obviously reusable.
Yeah.
With rockets, it's much harder to make a rocket reusable because Earth has a deep gravity well and a thick atmosphere. And these make it just barely possible to achieve reusability with a rocket. And there have been many prior attempts to create a fully reusable rocket. And most of those attempts have been abandoned partway through because they didn't think they could succeed. In order to achieve full reusability, everything's got to be perfect. The engines, the structure, the avionics, the choice of propellant. You've got to go to extreme measures for mass optimization, which is why we have the tower catch the rocket instead of putting on landing legs, which are heavy. The rocket can simply be caught by the tower. And we haven't achieved full reusability yet, but we do expect to achieve that hopefully later this year with Starship. And then you've got to achieve full reusability. You've got to go a step beyond that, which is make it rapidly reusable, such that the rocket lands, it gets caught by the tower, gets put back on the launch stand, and can be flown again without any refurbishment or laborious inspection, like an aircraft.
Yeah.
This is incredibly difficult. This is the first time that there's ever been a rocket where that is possible. That's what makes Starship so profound. I mean, it also happens to be the largest flying object ever made, the heaviest flying object ever made, the most powerful moving object of any kind. Starship V3 is more than double the thrust of the Saturn V moon rocket. By version 4, we'll be pretty much 3 times the thrust of a Saturn V moon rocket. And we expect Starship to be flying more than once per hour down the road.
One of the fun facts from Flight 12, that was actually the heaviest payload SpaceX has ever flown. And that's still just a fraction of what V3 can do. So,
yes.
I mean, once we're flying massive amounts really rapidly, I mean, we already fly the majority of payload to space with Falcon. Do people even really understand what mass to orbit becomes once Starship is flying?
It's many orders of magnitude greater than what is the case today. So even with Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, SpaceX delivers almost 90% of all Earth mass to orbit. I think we're somewhere between 85 and 90% right now. And then most of the remaining mass, I think, is launched by China. And then the rest of the world, including the rest of the US, is the remaining, 5 to 7%. Now with Starship, we'll be aiming to go from somewhere around 2,500 tons a year to orbit to millions of tons per year to orbit. And to do so at a pretty short period of time. So we think probably we can get to 1 million tons to orbit per year in about 3 years, thereabouts.
Starship is going to take care of the mass to orbit limiting factor.
Yes.
And then power generation. So first, and Ian, maybe you can help. People probably struggle to visualize a little bit when you say like data center in space. Like we're not going to slap engines on a building and fly it up there. Like these actually look like pretty different. And so kind of walk through how you take something that's in a giant building on the ground and turn it into something that's functional in space.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting. A lot of people don't actually know what the inside of a data center even looks like, right?
Yeah.
And
it's some like mythical place where the internet's in the cloud or something.
Yeah, some people envision wires, some people envision boxes, but like effectively it comes down to a set number of chips and the things that we need to launch into space are actually quite small when we look at it. The more challenging part is figuring out how do you get the power for it, and that's where a lot of what we've worked on for existing like Starwing technology, the solar arrays, are what we want to utilize that expertise to be able to build a satellite that can actually launch the critical components of the data center into space itself. We like to look at this and say, like, what is the actual engineering problem here? And it's really a combination of delivering power and then taking the waste heat and energy away and sending it into the vacuum of space, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Now the AI satellite is actually much simpler than a Starlink satellite. A Starlink satellite has gigantic phased array antennas. It's got parabolic antennas. It's got a lot of laser links. It's much more complicated than an AI satellite. An AI satellite is essentially a lot of solar cells, a radiator, and you still need some laser links, but you don't have all of the super complex antennas that you have on a Starlink satellite. So, I mean, given the two, the easier one to design for is the AI satellite.
Yeah. And
It's just a little bit bigger.
It's bigger.
Just make stuff bigger, yeah. I was like, so we've got, this is our AI1, if you guys want to walk us through.
Yeah, so the first thing that we're really looking at here is, like, first you've got to make something compelling, right? And we thought that the right place to start is around the 150 kilowatt, like, peak power level. But as we look at the workloads with our experience with XAI, we get to actually see that we can also support about 120 kilowatts of average compute. There's a difference.
Yeah. What we're showing here is kind of a draft version of the version 1 of the SpaceX AI satellite, an AI1, I guess you could call it. And seems like a reasonable place to start is 150 kilowatts peak power, 120 kilowatts sustained power, and to give you a sense of what does that actually look like in terms of the size of the radiators, size of the solar panels. The assumptions here are 250 watts per square meter for the solar array, and about 1,400 watts per square meter for the radiators. So the radiators, these are double-sided. Radiators are radiating both sides. They're oriented knife edge to the sun, and it's 1,400 watts per square meter is a very achievable goal. Over time, we think we can probably do above 250 watts per square meter and above 1,400 watts per square meter for the solar panels and radiators, respectively. But this gives you like this is pretty much what the satellite's going to look like.
Yeah.
It's a lot of solar panels, radiator, and then everything else is pretty small by comparison.
And these are like evolutions of things that we have actually already launched in our Starlink constellation to date.
Yeah.
That's really, I think, the cool part to me is that we're looking at solar technology that we already are going to use on the V3 Starlink vehicle. So I'm like really excited to then just take those and make it bigger.
Yeah, part of what we want to convey here is that there's not some magic that's necessary that doesn't exist for the AI satellites. As Ian said, a lot of this is technology we've already made for the Starlink V3 satellites. So we don't think this is a super hard problem compared to things we already do. There would also be probably something on the order of a terabit of connectivity, of laser link connectivity from the satellite. The 150 kilowatt peak power level roughly matches what, say, an NVIDIA GB300 rack would do. So if you've got a GB300 with 72 GPUs, its peak power I think is around 140 kilowatts. But it's almost impossible to get it to be at that peak power. A more reasonable operating envelope would be around 120 kilowatts average power. But it can peak up to 150. So it's basically, think of it as a rack of compute in space. And then you can connect these racks of compute to either each other via the laser links or directly to the Starlink constellation. So you can close the link with the Starlink constellation, and then Starlink can then send that data to the ground using the existing Ka and Ku antennas on the vehicle. It also has laser links to the ground as well. So, and this would not be at a particularly high latency. We're talking about maybe being around 600 to 800 kilometers above the Earth, and light travels 300 kilometers per millisecond. So that's it's about 3 milliseconds away. Basically, it's not very far.
Won't worry about that too much then.
It's not. Sometimes people worry, think there's going to be some like high latency. I'm like, no, speed of light moves pretty fast.
Light moves pretty fast. It's all one.
Yeah.
I think the cool thing also is the radiators themselves are about the same size as the existing solar arrays for the V3 vehicle. Kind of in that realm where we're flying today.
Yeah.
So I mean, they got about a 70-meter wingspan. So these are fairly large. We're talking about building a lot of them and putting them up there. But you like to say like space is in the name. Like there's a lot of space up there. And so even when you're talking thousands or even up to 1 million satellites, you got plenty of room to move around up there.
Yeah, space is really big. So it's not like space is going to get crowded. Space is enormous. Like if you zoom in close to the satellite, it looks big, but if you actually look at it relative to the Earth, these satellites are so tiny you can't even see them. So they're very, very tiny compared to Earth.
And I mean, we have about 10,000 Starlinks in orbit right now.
Yeah.
We've got a pretty good idea of how to operate just really large constellations and do it safely now, right?
We are the only operator that has any experience to that scale. It's a great thing that we have this background, so we know how tightly we can pack the satellites and fly them safely. That's a number one goal when we look at the constellation.
We're going to be building a lot of satellites, and we're going to be building them here in Bastrop, right? So we've got this, which so we're in that building kind of in the middle, which
we're sitting in that building right now.
This is my first time here. The building is massive. Like you come around the corner, you see it through the trees, and you're like, oh wow. But we're about to kind of put this building to shame, aren't we?
Yes, we're going to. In fact, we already have the solar manufacturing facility. It's under construction already, and then we will be building out the AI-SAT production building soon. So we expect to have the AI-SAT production, the solar production, and all of that operating at some reasonable volume by the end of next year.
So if anybody wants to work on AI satellites, this is kind of going to become the hub of that. We're also, so I mean, like right behind us, the machines are humming. We're still making all of our user terminals for Starlink here. Yeah. That's not going anywhere. In fact, we're turning on new production lines for new units, right?
Yes. In fact, these are the new Starlink terminals.
Systems and methods for projectile propulsion. Abstract. A projectile propulsion system comprises a housing defining a chamber, a propulsive charge including a propulsive charge material loadable into the chamber, a projectile loadable into the chamber proximate to the propulsive charge material, an electric pulse discharge subsystem that provides an electric pulse having a specified pulse amperage for a specified pulse period, a current delivery subsystem electrically connecting the electric pulse discharge subsystem to the chamber to deliver the electric pulse to the propulsive charge material, wherein the specified pulse amperage and the specified pulse period are sufficient to cause at least a portion of the propulsive charge material to generate a propulsive force that is at least partially directed onto the projectile to drive the projectile out of the chamber, and a barrel in fluid communication with the chamber configured to receive the projectile as it is driven from the chamber. Description. Systems and methods for projectile propulsion priority applications. This application is a continuation of and claims priority to U.S. Patent Application Serial Number 17160. 081, filed January 27, 2021, the content of which is incorporated herein by reference in its entirety. Background. Conventionally, projectile weapons are powered by chemical potential energy that is converted into kinetic energy. For example, a conventional firearm round includes gunpowder, smokeless powder, or some other propellant that is ignited by a primer, which causes the propellant to deflagrate. Gases from the burning propellant become pressurized and expand, which push a projectile, such as a bullet or slug, out of the firing chamber and through the bore of a gun barrel. While chemical-based projectile weapons have been the standard for hundreds of years, the small amount of propellant that can be practically placed in the small volume of the firing chamber limits the propulsive force that can be generated, and therefore limits the speed at which the projectile can be fired and the distance that the projectile can be shot. Summary of the disclosure. The present disclosure describes systems and methods for projectile propulsion where the propulsive force is supplied by an electrically overloaded capacitor, which causes a portion of the capacitor to explode and generate an explosive propulsive force to propel a projectile with substantially more force and at a substantially higher speed than is achievable by a conventional powder-based round having a similar size. This summary is intended to provide an overview of subject matter of the present disclosure. It is not intended to provide an exclusive or exhaustive explanation of the invention. The detailed description is included to provide further information about the present disclosure. Brief description of the drawings. In the drawings, which are not necessarily drawn to scale, like numerals, may describe similar components in different views. The drawings illustrate generally, by way of example, but not by way of limitation, various embodiments discussed in the present document. Fig. 1 is a side view of an example weapon configured to propel a projectile via force generated by applying an electric pulse to a propulsive charge. Fig. 2 is a partial cross-sectional side view of the example weapon of Fig. 1. Figs. 3A, 3C are close-up cross-sectional side views of an example propulsive cartridge that uses the force generated by electrically overloading a capacitor to propel a projectile from a propulsion chamber in the example weapon of Figs. 1 and 2 at different points in time during firing of the weapon. Fig. 4 is a circuit diagram of an example pulse discharge system to provide an electric pulse that can be used in the example weapon of Figs. 1 and 2. Figs. 5A and SB are close-up cross-sectional side views of an alternative example propulsive cartridge that uses the force generated by a water arc explosion to propel a projectile from the propulsion chamber in the example weapon of Fig. 1. Figs. 6A and 6B are close-up cross-sectional side views of a water arc chamber that uses the force generated by a water arc explosion of at least a portion of water in the water arc chamber to propel a projectile from the water arc chamber in an example weapon similar to the weapon of Fig. 1. Detailed description. The following detailed description discloses a novel weapon system and a novel method for propelling a projectile. Specifically, the present disclosure describes novel propellant mechanisms for providing the propulsive energy to eject the projectile from a propulsion chamber. In an example, the novel propellant mechanism comprises electrically overloading a capacitor and a projectile positioned at a leading end of the propulsive charge. When the capacitor is electrically overloaded with a short, burst electric pulse having sufficiently high amperage, e.g., on the order of several kiloamps or more in a sufficiently short period of time, e.g., for a few microseconds or less, the burst of electric energy provided by the overloading pulse causes a portion of the capacitor to generate an explosive propulsive force. For example, if an electrolyte is used for one or more of the conductive structures within the capacitor, the burst of energy from the overloading pulse can essentially instantaneously vaporize the electrolyte, which will then expand rapidly to generate the propulsive force. In some examples, the propulsive force generated by electrically overloading the capacitor is substantially larger than the force that is achievable by conventional powder-based ammunition. The large propulsive force that is produced by the overloaded capacitor can be directed toward the projectile so that the propulsive force drives the projectile forward out of the weapon, e.g., through a barrel that is in fluid communication with the chamber in which the capacitor overloading takes place. In another example, the propellant mechanism comprises generation of an electrostatic arc-liberated water explosion, which generates a rapidly expanding cold water vapor or cold fog cloud that can be channeled to propel a projectile from the weapon. Similar to the electrical overloading of the capacitor in the previous example, it has been found that arc-liberated water explosions can also generate a substantial amount of propulsive force that can be used to drive the projectile at a high speed. The present detailed description includes references to the accompanying drawings, which form a part of the detailed description. The drawings show, by way of illustration, specific embodiments in which the invention may be practiced. These embodiments, which are also referred to herein as examples, are described in enough detail to enable those skilled in the art to practice the invention. The example embodiments may be combined, other embodiments may be utilized, or structural and logical changes may be made without departing from the scope of the present invention. While the disclosed subject matter will be described in conjunction with the enumerated claims, it will be understood that the exemplified subject matter is not intended to limit the claims to the disclosed subject matter. The following detailed description is, therefore, not to be taken in a limiting sense, and the scope of the present invention is defined by the appended claims and their equivalents. References in the specification to one embodiment, an example embodiment, etc. indicate that the embodiment described can include a particular feature, structure, or characteristic, but every embodiment may not necessarily include the particular feature, structure, or characteristic. Moreover, such phrases are not necessarily referring to the same embodiment. Further, when a particular feature, structure, or characteristic is described in connection with an embodiment, it is submitted that it is within the knowledge of one skilled in the art to affect such feature, structure, or characteristic in connection with other embodiments whether or not explicitly described. Values expressed in a range format should be interpreted in a flexible manner to include not only the numerical values explicitly recited as the limits of the range, but also to include all the individual numerical values or subranges encompassed within that range as if each numerical value and subrange is explicitly recited. For example, a concentration range of about 0.1% to about 5% should be interpreted to include not only the explicitly recited concentration of about 0.1 Wt % to about 5 Wt %, but also the individual concentrations and the subranges within the indicated range. The statement, about x to y, has the same meaning as about x to about y, unless indicated otherwise. Likewise, the statement, about x, y, or about z, has the same meaning as about x, about y, or about z, unless indicated otherwise. In this document, the terms a, in, or the are used to include one or more than one unless the context clearly dictates otherwise. The term or is used to refer to a non-exclusive, or unless otherwise indicated. Unless indicated otherwise, the statement, at least one of, when referring to a listed group is used to mean one or any combination of two or more of the members of the group. For example, the statement, at least one of A, B, and C, can have the same meaning as A, B, C, A and B, A and C, B and C, or A, B, and C, or the statement, at least one of D, E, F, and G, can have the same meaning as D, E, F, G, D and E, D and F, D and G. E and F, E and G, F and G, D, E, and F, D, E, and G, D, F, and G, E, F, and G, or D, E, F, and G. A comma can be used as a delimiter or digit group separator to the left or right of a decimal mark. For example, 0.0001 inch is equivalent to 0.0001. In this document, the terms including and in which are used as the plain English equivalents of the respective terms, comprising and wherein. Also, in the following claims, the terms including and comprising are open-ended. That is, a system, device, article, composition, formulation, or process that includes elements in addition to those listed after such a term in a claim are still deemed to fall within the scope of that claim. Moreover, in the folioing claims, the terms first, second, and third, etc. are used merely as labels, and are not intended to impose numerical requirements on their objects. In the methods described herein, the steps can be carried out in any order without departing from the principles of the invention, except when a temporal or operational sequence is explicitly recited. Furthermore, specified steps can be carried out concurrently unless explicit language recites that they be carried out separately. For example, a recited act of doing X and a recited act of doing Y can be conducted simultaneously within a single operation, and the resulting process will fall within the literal scope of the process. Recitation in a claim to the effect that first a step is performed, and then several other steps are subsequently performed, shall be taken to mean that the first step is performed before any of the other steps, but the other steps can be performed in any suitable sequence, unless a sequence is further recited within the other steps. For example, claim elements that recite Step A, Step B, Step C, Step D, and Step E, shall be construed to mean Step A is carried out first, Step E is carried out last, and Steps B, C, and D can be carried out in any sequence between Steps A and E, and that the sequence still falls within the literal scope of the claimed process. A given step or subset of steps can also be repeated. Furthermore, specified steps can be carried out concurrently unless explicit claim language recites that they be carried out separately. For example, a claimed step of doing X and a claimed step of doing Y can be conducted simultaneously within a single operation, and the resulting process will fall within the literal scope of the claimed process. The term about, as used herein, can allow for a degree of variability in a value or range. For example, within 10%, within 5%, within 1%, within 0.5%, within 0.1%, within 0.05%, within 0.01%, within 0.005%. The term substantially is. In addition, it is to be understood that the phraseology or terminology employed herein, and not otherwise defined, is for the purpose of description only and not of limitation. Furthermore, all publications, patents, and patent documents referred to in this document are incorporated by reference herein in their entirety, as though individually incorporated by reference. In the event of inconsistent usages between this document and those documents so incorporated by reference, the usage in the incorporated reference should be considered supplementary to that of this document. For irreconcilable inconsistencies, the usage in this document controls. Fig 1 shows a side view of an example projectile weapon 10 that incorporates one or more of methods of propulsive force generation via application of a large electric pulse with a specified pulse amperage and/or a specified pulse voltage for a specified period of time, as discussed briefly above. The projectile weapon 10, which will also be referred to simply as the weapon 10 inches for the sake of brevity, is configured to propel a projectile 12, such as a bullet, a slug, or a ball, by taking advantage of the propulsive force generated by converting electrical energy to kinetic energy, described in more detail below. The weapon 10 includes many aspects that are similar or even identical to those of more conventional, powder-based firearms. For example, the projectile 12 is ejected from the weapon 10 via barrel 14. The weapon 10 includes a grip 16 that a user can use to hold the weapon 10 when firing. A firing trigger 18 is located close to the grip 16, which can be actuated by the user to initiate the sequence that fires the projectile 12. A trigger guard 20 can be included around the trigger 18 to minimize the likelihood of accidental firing of the weapon 10. The weapon 10 shown in Fig 1 is configured like a rifle with a butt stock 22, also referred to simply as the stock 22, at a proximal end of the weapon 10 that the user can abut against his or her shoulder or other part of the body for stability while firing the weapon 10. A forestock 24 closer to the distal end of the weapon 10 can be held by the hand opposite his or her trigger hand to aim and further steady the weapon 10 during firing. In an example, a handguard 26 is provided around a portion of the forestock 24 to protect the user's hand, such as from heat that may be generated by firing of the weapon 10 and dissipated through the forestock 24 by heat conduction. In an example, the weapon 10 also includes a carrying handle 28 on a top side of the barrel 14 to provide another option for carrying the weapon 10. In an example, the handle 28 can also provide a mounting location for a targeting device or mechanism 30 so that the targeting device or mechanism 30 will be at a specified location and orientation relative to the barrel 14 for accurate targeting. In an example, the targeting device or mechanism 30 comprises a laser targeting system 30 that emits a laser 32 for highly precise targeting. In another example, in addition to or in place of the laser targeting system 30, the weapon 10 can include a high-resolution or ultra-high-resolution camera 34 directed forward from the weapon 10, such as on a distal end of the forestock 24. The camera 34 can capture an image or video of a target, which the user can view, for example on a small display 36 that can be conveniently viewed by the user during firing, such as proximate to the stock 22 at the proximal end of the weapon 10. In an example, a reticle can be superimposed over the image or video captured by the camera 34 to indicate to the user the expected location where the projectile 12 will travel. In an example, the weapon 10 can include an onboard computer that can control one or more subsystems of the weapon 10 such as the laser targeting system 30, the camera 34, and the display 36. The onboard computer or a computer-readable medium accessible by the onboard computer can be programmed to further assist the user in targeting. The programming can include one or more instructions to assist the user or otherwise enhance firing of the weapon 10. Examples of the one or more instructions that can be programmed onto the onboard computer or a computer-readable medium accessible by the onboard computer include, but are not limited to: A. Calculating distance to a target acquired by the laser targeting system 30 and/or the camera 34. B. Measuring or acquiring information regarding one or more meteorological conditions that can affect viewing of the target and/or the path of the projectile 12 through the air after it leaves the barrel 14. Including, but not limited to, wind speed, wind direction, air temperature, air updraft or downdraft, relative humidity, altitude, and the like. C. Compensating the targeting to account for one or more conditions such as the distance to the target or one or more of the meteorological conditions. D. Analyzing information provided by the laser targeting system 30, which can be configured as a sensor for measuring one or more of the meteorological conditions in addition to being used as a targeting laser. E. Synthesizing information captured by both the laser targeting system 30 and the high-resolution camera 34 to provide for more accurate targeting than would be achieved by either alone. F. Processing or analyzing the image or video captured by the camera 34 in order to identify or extract one or more physical features, such as for edge recognition, comber recognition, contour recognition, facial recognition, mapping one or more structures in the image or video, color detection and/or color mapping, identifying object based on data extracted from the image or video captured by the camera 34, determining motion of one or more objects or structures in the captured image or video and/or estimating where the object or structure will move in a specified future time period. G. Acquiring navigational information, such as from a GPS satellite and providing information regarding location of one or more of the weapon 10. A target acquired by a targeting device or mechanism 30 such as the laser targeting system 30 or the high-resolution camera 34, and a projectile 12 that has been fired by the weapon 10. And H, measuring or calculating information regarding charging and firing readiness of the weapon 10 and or providing such information to the user, for example through the display 36. In addition to the more conventional aspects of the weapon 10 described above, the weapon 10 includes a novel means of generating the propulsive energy that drives the projectile 12 out of the barrel 14 at a high speed. As mentioned above, in an example the propulsive force is generated by electrically overloading a capacitor, which causes a portion of the capacitor to generate a propulsive force that propels the projectile 12. Fig 2 shows a partial cross-sectional view of the weapon 10 that reveals the structures that can provide for this capacitive-based propulsive force. In an example, the weapon 10 includes an internal housing defining a propulsion chamber 40 that can receive both the projectile 12 and a propulsive capacitor 42, also referred to hereinafter as the capacitor. 42. The weapon 10 further comprises one or more subsystems configured to electrically overload the capacitor 42 to generate an explosive propulsive force in order to drive the projectile 12 from the chamber 40, such as through a bore 44 within the barrel 14. In an example, the capacitor 42 includes an electrolyte, such as in an electrolytic capacitor wherein the cathode is formed at least in part by an electrolyte. In such an example, the electrical overloading of the capacitor 42 causes the electrolyte to vaporize. If the electrical overloading occurs in a short enough period of time and with sufficient electrical energy, this vaporizing of the electrolyte can manifest as an explosive expansion of gas that can drive the projectile 12 with a very large amount of propulsive force. Figs 3a, 3b, and 3c show close-up views of an example propulsive capacitor 42 within the chamber 40 at 3 points in time during firing of the weapon 10. Fig 3a shows the capacitor 42 before firing of the weapon 10 has begun, e.g., such that the propulsive capacitor 42 is fully intact. The capacitor 42 and the projectile 12 are positioned within the chamber 40. In an example, the projectile 12 and the capacitor 42 are combined together in a single structure 50, similar to the charge and the projectile of a powder-based cartridge. For that reason, the combined structure 50 of the projectile 12 and the capacitor 42 will be referred to hereinafter as the capacitive cartridge 50 inches or simply as the cartridge 50. In an example, the cartridge 50 includes a casing 52 that at least partially surrounds the capacitor 42 and at least a portion of the projectile 12 so that the cartridge 50 can be easily transported as a single unit. The casing 52 can also act to direct the force that is generated by the vaporized electrolyte 46 so that the projectile 12 is driven in the desired forward direction. In an example, the weapon 10 includes a storage chamber 51 for holding cartridges 50 that can be loaded into the chamber 40, e.g., after a previous cartridge 50 has been fired to eject its projectile 12 from the weapon 10. The weapon 10 can also include a passageway through which a cartridge 50 can be loaded into the chamber 40. Such a passageway can connect the cartridge storage chamber 51 on one end and with the chamber 40 on the other end. The weapon 10 can further include a mechanism for loading an unfired capacitor 42 to the chamber 40, e.g., by moving the capacitor 42 from the cartridge storage chamber 51 to the chamber 40 through the passageway. The weapon 10 can also include a mechanism for ejecting spent casings 52 from the weapon 10 after the capacitor 42 has been overloaded and the projectile 12 has been fired. As noted above, in an example, the capacitor 42 is an electrolytic capacitor. In an example, the electrolytic cathode 42 includes a cathode metal 54 that is in electrical communication with the electrolyte 46 and an anode 56 that is separated from the electrolyte 46 by an oxide layer 58 formed on the anode 56. The cathode metal 54 and the electrolyte 46 can act together as the cathode of the capacitor 42, and the oxide layer 58 can act as a dielectric that separates the anode 56 from the cathode. The anode 56 can be electrically connected to a capacitor anode terminal 60, such as with an anode conductor 62. Similarly, the cathode metal 54 can be electrically connected to a capacitor cathode terminal 64, such as with a cathode conductor 66. In an example, the capacitor 42 can be positioned within the chamber 40 so that the terminals 60 and 64 can be electrically connected to a firing mechanism. For example, the capacitor 42 can be positioned so that each terminal 64 will be in electrical contact with a corresponding contact pad, such as an anode contact pad 68 in electrical contact with the capacitor anode terminal 60 and a cathode contact pad 70 in electrical contact with the capacitor cathode terminal 64. The anode and cathode contact pads 68 and 70 form part of an electrical circuit with the firing mechanism that can deliver an electrical pulse to the capacitor 42, such as via pulse delivery conductors 72, 74. In an example, the firing mechanism includes an electrical pulse discharge subsystem that can deliver an electrical pulse to the capacitor 42 via the conductors 72, 74, as described in more detail below. Continuing with Fig 3b, once the firing mechanism is activated, an electrical pulse is delivered to the capacitor 42 through the conductors 72, 74. The electrical pulse is configured to supply a large specified amount of electrical energy 5 to the capacitor 42 in a short specified period of time such that an overloading voltage potential will result between the anode 56 and the combined cathode metal 54 and the electrolyte 46. In an example, the large overloading voltage potential supplies enough energy to the capacitor 42 that it instantaneously or substantially instantaneously vaporizes the electrolyte 46, which generates a rapidly expanding 10 cloud of vaporized electrolyte 76. The rapid expansion of vaporized electrolyte 76 generates a large propulsive force Fp, at least a portion of which is imparted onto the projectile 12 to drive it forward from the chamber 40 and into the barrel bore 44. In an example, the chamber 40 or the cartridge 50, or both, are configured to direct the expanding vaporized electrolyte 76 forward so that as much of the force generated 15 by the expanding vaporized electrolyte 76 will be used as the propulsive force Fp rather than expanding in other directions and/or generating wasted heat energy that dissipates through the weapon 10. For example, the chamber 40 can be sized and shaped so that the expanding vaporized electrolyte 76 is directed toward the bore 44. In another example, the cartridge 50 can include the casing 52, as mentioned above, 20 which can be made from a material that is sufficiently strong to withstand the force of the expanding vaporized electrolyte 76 without breaching. The expanding vaporized electrolyte 76 can then be directed out of a distal opening 78 in the casing 52 so that the propulsive force Fp of the expanding vaporized electrolyte 76 is directed forward to drive the projectile 12 down the bore 44 in the desired firing 25 direction, as shown in Fig. 3c. The potential energy available in the capacitor 42 to drive the projectile 12 is a function of the capacitance and voltage potential of the capacitor 42. In an ideal capacitor, the charge that the capacitor is able to store is defined by equation 30 Q cap equals V cap x C cap, where Q cap is the charge the capacitor is able to store, in coulombs, V cap is the voltage across the capacitor, in volts, and C cap is the capacitance of the capacitor, in farads. For the same capacitor, the energy that can be stored by the capacitor, and therefore the potential energy that can be discharged from the capacitor, is defined by equation, where E cap is the energy storage capacity of the capacitor in question, in joules. In the case of the capacitor 42 in the example weapon 10 of Figs. 1, 2, and 3a3c, E cap is equal to the potential energy that the capacitor can discharge that can be converted to kinetic energy to propel the projectile 12, which will also be referred to hereinafter as projectile kinetic energy, or EK project. For the purposes of illustration, in a non-limiting example, the capacitor 42 has a voltage potential of 100 V and a capacitance of 100,000 microfarads. According to equation, the example capacitor 42 is able to store a charge Q cap of 10 C. And according to equation, The potential energy E cap the capacitor 42 can store and discharge is 500 J, as will be appreciated by those having skill in the art in powder-based ammunition. A typical .22-inch caliber round is able to generate about 168 J of energy to propel the .22 caliber projectile. Therefore, this example capacitor 42, i.e. 100 volts, 100,000 microfarads, can potentially exert 297% of the energy onto the projectile 12 that the powder of a .22 caliber round can provide. Of course, practically speaking, not all of this potential energy ECAP will actually be converted to projectile kinetic energy EK project. For example, at least some of the stored electrical energy ECAP may not be discharged into the electrolyte 46. At least a portion of the discharged electrical energy may be converted to heat energy rather than kinetic energy. Or at least a portion of the kinetic energy in the rapidly expanding vaporized electrolyte 76 can be misdirected to a structure other than the projectile 12, such as the cartridge casing 52 or the body of the weapon 10. Even if a sizable percentage of the potential propulsive energy ECAP in the capacitor 42 is not converted to projectile kinetic energy EK project. However, the weapon 10 will still be able to eject the projectile 12 with substantially more propulsive force FP, and thus at a substantially higher velocity than is possible with a typical .22 caliber powder-based round. For example, even if only 50% of the potential energy in the example capacitor 42 is converted to projectile kinetic energy EK project, the weapon 10 will still generate 50% more projectile kinetic energy EK project than a typical .22 caliber powder-based round. Electric pulse discharge subsystem is mentioned above. In an example, the capacitor 42 is electrically overloaded in order to generate the propulsive force, such as by vaporizing an electrolyte 46 in the capacitor 42 as described above with respect to the example shown in Figs. 3a3c. As is also mentioned above, in an example the capacitor 42 can be electrically overloaded by delivery of an overloading electric pulse to the capacitor 42, wherein the electric pulse has a specified current and/or a specified voltage for a specified period of time, which will also be referred to hereinafter as the specified pulse period of time, or simply the specified period. In an example, the overloading electric pulse that is delivered to the capacitor 42 is provided by an electric pulse discharge system. In a preferred example, the pulse discharge system is an onboard subsystem of the weapon 10, e.g., so that the weapon 10 can be fired without having to be tethered to a separate pulse discharge device. Returning to Fig. 2, in an example, the weapon 10 includes an electric pulse discharge subsystem 80 that is configured to generate and discharge an overloading electric pulse having the specified current and/or the specified voltage for the specified period. Fig. 4 shows a circuit diagram of an example pulse discharge circuit for the pulse discharge subsystem 80. As described above, in an example the pulse discharge subsystem 80 supplies the electric pulse to the capacitor 42 via the conductors 72, 74. In an example, the conductors 72, 74 are electrically connected to the contact pads 68, 70 so that the electric pulse can be passed from the contact pads 68, 70 to the terminals 60, 64, and then to the anode 56 and the cathode metal 66, respectively. The sudden surge in the voltage potential between the anode 56 and the cathode 46. 54 that results from the electric pulse then instantaneously or substantially instantaneously vaporizes the electrolyte 46, creating the propulsive force Fp that drives the projectile 12, as described above with respect to Figs. 3a3c. In an example, the pulse discharge subsystem 80 comprises a plurality of capacitors 82 connected in parallel. The parallel connection can allow each of the discharge capacitors 82 to be discharged simultaneously or substantially simultaneously. The capacitors 82 of the pulse discharge subsystem 80 will be referred to as the pulse discharge capacitors 82 inches or the discharge capacitors 82 inches in order to distinguish them from the capacitor 42 that propels the projectile 12, which will be referred to hereinafter as the propulsive capacitor 42. The plurality of discharge capacitors 82 of the pulse discharge subsystem 80 will be referred to collectively as a bank 84 of the discharge capacitors 82, or simply, the capacitor bank 84. The discharge capacitors 82 are configured, e.g., with a specified voltage and capacitance, and are connected together such that all of the discharge capacitors 82 can be rapidly and simultaneously or substantially simultaneously discharged, generating the electric pulse in the specified pulse period and with the specified pulse amperage and/or the specified pulse voltage. The parallel connection can allow each discharge capacitor 82 to rapidly discharge at the same time or substantially the same time as all the other discharge capacitors 82 in the capacitor bank 84. This simultaneous or substantially simultaneous discharging can allow the current discharging from all of the discharge capacitors 82 to combine as they come together into an electric pulse with a single conductive pathway, such as in one of the conductors 72, 74. The total combined energy discharging from all the discharging capacitors 82 results in the electric pulse having a sufficiently high current over a sufficiently short period of time such that the electric pulse will have sufficiently high energy to activate a propulsive charge, which drives the projectile 12 out of the weapon 10 at very high speeds. The pulse discharge subsystem 80 can also include a switching device or mechanism that closes an electrical circuit between the capacitor bank 84 and the propulsive capacitor 42. In an example, the switching device or mechanism is operatively connected to the trigger 18 so that when the user of the weapon 10 pulls the trigger 18 it causes the electrical pulse to be discharged from the capacitor bank 84 through the conductors 72, 74 and into the propulsive capacitor 42. In an example, the switching device or mechanism comprises an electrical pulse discharge switch 86 that switches between an open state or configuration and a closed state or configuration. When the switch 86 is in the open state or configuration, the electrical circuit that includes the capacitor bank, the conductors 72, 74, and the propulsive capacitor 42 is an open circuit, i.e., a broken circuit such that electrical current cannot flow through the conductors 72, 74, and therefore such that the electric pulse cannot be discharged from the pulse discharge capacitors 82. When the switch 86 is in the closed state or configuration, the electrical circuit is closed and electrical current can flow through the conductors 72, 74 to the propulsive capacitor 42, which penults the electric pulse to be discharged from the bank of discharge capacitors 82 and to be passed to the propulsive capacitor 42 in order to overload the capacitor 42 to generate the propulsive force Fp that propels the projectile 12 forward from the chamber 40. The discharge switch 86 can include a mechanical-based switching device or a circuit-based switching device, or both. A mechanical-based switching device is physically movable between a first position corresponding to the open state or configuration and a second position corresponding to the closed state or configuration, or a circuit-based switching device. Examples of mechanical-based switching devices that can be used as at least part of the switch 86 include, but are not limited to, a toggle switch or a mechanical limit switch. A circuit-based switching device can include a semiconductor structure that can be electrically actuated between a first electrical state wherein no electrical current can pass through the circuit structure, which corresponds to the open state or configuration, and a second electrical state wherein electrical current can pass through the circuit structure, which corresponds to the closed state or configuration. Examples of circuit-based switching devices that can be used as at least part of the switch 86 include, but are not limited to, a diode switch, a bipolar junction transistor switch, a junction field effect transistor switch, an insulated gate field effect transistor switch, such as a metal oxide semiconductor field effect transistor switch, or a thyristor-based switch, such as a Shockley diode, a silicon-controlled rectifier, or a silicon-controlled switch. Electric pulse discharge and charging circuit. Fig 4 shows a circuit diagram of an example electric pulse discharge and capacitor bank charging circuit 90, which will also be referred to hereinafter as the pulse discharge and charging circuit 90 inches or simply as the circuit 90. In an example, the circuit 90 is configured to discharge an electric pulse having the specified amperage and/or the specified voltage for the specified period of time to the propulsive capacitor 42. In an example, the circuit 90 includes a pulse discharge circuit loop 92 and a capacitor bank charging circuit loop 94. As its name implies, the electric pulse loop 92 provides the electrical connection between the capacitor bank 84 and the propulsive capacitor 42 so that when the capacitor bank 84 is discharged, the resulting overloading electric pulse will be supplied to the propulsive capacitor 42. The flow of the overloading electric pulse 96 is represented by the large arrow in Fig. 4 through the electric pulse loop 92. The direction of the arrow corresponds to the direction that electrons are actually flowing through the electric pulse loop 92. In other words, the arrow uses electron flow notation to indicate the actual direction of electron flow, as opposed to conventional current notation, which indicates the direction of positive charge flow. The same electron flow notation will be used to indicate the direction of electron flow for other parts of the circuit 90, as discussed below. As discussed above, in an example, the discharge capacitors 82 of the capacitor bank 84 are connected in parallel. The parallel arrangement results in the anode sides of each of the discharge capacitors 82 being in electrical communication with the cathode side of the propulsive capacitor 42. Similarly, the anode side of the propulsive capacitor 42 is in electrical communication with the cathode sides of the pulse discharge capacitors 82. When the capacitor Hank 84 is discharged, the electrons of the resulting electric pulse 96 are discharged from the anode sides of the pulse discharge capacitors 82 so that the electric pulse 96 is delivered to the cathode 46. 54 of the propulsive capacitor 42 via the pulse discharge conductor 74, the cathode contact pad 70, the cathode terminal 64, and the cathode conductor 66. As the propulsive capacitor 42 is overloaded, the electric pulse 96 passes between its cathode 54 and anode 56. The electrical energy of the electric pulse 96 can combine with at least a portion of the electrical charge that had been stored on the anode 56 and the cathode 46. 54 to vaporize the electrolyte 46 and generate the propulsive force Fp from the rapidly expanding vaporized electrolyte 76, as described above. Then, the electrical energy that had crossed to the anode 56 exits the propulsive capacitor 42 so that the electric pulse 96 can return to the cathode sides of the discharge capacitors 82 in the capacitor bank 84. As mentioned above, a pulse discharge swatch 86 can be included to allow a user to initiate discharging of the capacitor bank 84 to generate the electric pulse 96, overload the propulsive capacitor 42 and drive the projectile 12 from the weapon 10. As shown in Fig 4, the switch 86 can be included as part of the electric pulse loop 92 so that when the swatch 86 is in the open state, the electric pulse loop 92 is a broken or open circuit so that the electric pulse 96 will not be able to be generated or transmitted to the propulsive capacitor 42. When the switch 86 is in its closed state, current can flow through the swatch 86, which completes the electric pulse loop 92 so that there is an electrical pathway for the electrical energy stored in the capacitor bank 84 to flow as the electric pulse 96. As noted above, the specific type of device or mechanism that is used as the swatch 86 is not particularly important, and any practical mechanical-based or circuit-based switching device, or both, can be used to form the swatch 86. In Fig. 4, the swatch 86 is a circuit-based switch, and more specifically a silicon-controlled rectifier switch 86. A silicon-controlled rectifier is a transistor-based device that can be turned on by application of a small switching voltage between a gate terminal and a cathode terminal, which results in a base current flowing out of the gate. This base current, which is also referred to as a control current 98, causes the SCR switch 86 to be able to conduct a current of interest, such as the electric pulse 96, from the SCR cathode to the SCR anode, which allows the current of interest to flow 1 through the SCR switch 86. The cathode and the anode of the SCR switch 86 are electrically coupled to the anode side of the capacitor bank 84 and to the cathode side of the propulsive capacitor 42, respectively. When the control current 98 is drawn from the gate of the SCR switch 86, the SCR switch 86 becomes latched and the electric pulse 96 is generated so that it can flow out of the anode side of the capacitor bank 84, through the SCR switch 86, to the cathode side of the propulsive capacitor 42. In an example, the control current 98 is drawn from the gate of the SCR switch 86 via a triggering circuit loop 100. In an example, the trigger loop 100 includes a control current supply, such as a direct current battery, 102. An advantage of using a silicon-controlled rectifier as the switch is that the amperage that is necessary for the control current to activate or latch the silicon-controlled rectifier and the voltage necessary to generate the control current are both very low compared to the current that can flow through and the voltage that can be applied across the silicon-controlled rectifier. Therefore, even though the voltage across the anode and cathode of the SCR switch 86 corresponding to the electric pulse 96 can be as high as 200 volts or more, the battery, 102, can be as low as a standard 9 volts battery. The trigger loop 100 can also include a firing switch 104 that activates the control current 98 through the trigger loop 100, e.g., so that the control current 98 does not flow until the firing switch 104 is engaged. As shown in Fig. 4, the firing switch 104 is a mechanical device that can move between an open position and a closed position. When the firing switch 104 is in the open position, as is shown in Fig. 4, the trigger loop 100 is an open circuit so that the control current 98 cannot flow. When the firing switch 104 is in the dosed position, the trigger loop 100 becomes a complete, closed circuit so that the control current 98 can flow, and thus can activate the SCR switch 86. In an example, the firing switch 104 is operatively coupled to a mechanical actuator of the weapon 10, such as the firing trigger 18 shown in Figs. 1 and 2, when a user articulates the actuator, e.g., pulls the trigger 18, the firing switch 104 allows the control current 98 to flow from the baton, 102, which then latches the SCR switch 86 so that the electric pulse 96 will be generated by the capacitor bank 84. Another advantage of a silicon-controlled rectifier switch 86 is that the control current 98 need only be drawn from the gate of the SCR switch 86 for long enough for the electric pulse 96 to begin flowing through the SCR switch 86. Once the SCR switch 86 has been latched, the SCR switch 86 will remain latched and able to conduct the electric pulse 96 until the current of the electric pulse 96 falls below a cutoff current, which is lower than the amperage needed for the control current 98 to activate the SCR switch 86 in the first place. Since the electric pulse 96 begins flowing essentially instantaneously after the SCR switch 86 is activated by the control current 98, this means that the control current source, e.g., the battery 102, need only supply the control current 98 for a very short period of time. After that point, the trigger loop 100 can be reopened and the control current 98 can be ceased without cutting off the electric pulse loop 92. In an example, the firing switch 104 is configured so that when a user releases the force on the trigger 18, a biasing force acts on the firing switch 104 so that it will be moved into the open position. In other words, the firing switch 104 is configured to be in the open position by default unless a force is exerted on it to overcome the biasing force and move the switch 104 to the closed position. The capacitor bank charging loop 94 provides an electrical current that is capable of charging the discharge capacitors 82 of the capacitor bank 84, which is also referred to as a charging current 106. In an example, the charging current 106 is designed to have electrical properties e.g., current, voltage, and duration, that is able to charge the discharge capacitors 82 to their lull capacity such that the capacitor bank 84 will be able to generate a new electric pulse 96 to overload a new propulsive capacitor 42. Capacitors such as the discharge capacitors 82 require a DC current as the charging current 106. In an example, the charging loop 94 includes a source 108 for the charging current 106. The charging source 108 can be any device. 4. The swatch 86 is a circuit-based switch, and more specifically a As noted above, the specific type of device or mechanism that is used as the swatch 86 is not particularly important, and any practical mechanical-based or circuit-based switching device, or both, can be used to form the swatch 86. In Fig. 4, the swatch 86 is a circuit-based switch, and more specifically a silicon-controlled rectifier switch 86. A silicon-controlled rectifier is a transistor-based device that can be turned on by application of a small switching voltage between a gate terminal and a cathode terminal, which results in a base current flowing out of the gate. This base current, which is also referred to as a control current 98, causes the SCR switch 86 to be able to conduct a current of interest, such as the electric pulse 96, from the SCR cathode to the SCR anode, which allows the current of interest to flow 1 through the SCR switch 86. The cathode and the anode of the SCR switch 86 are electrically coupled to the anode side of the capacitor bank 84 and to the cathode side of the propulsive capacitor 42, respectively. When the control current 98 is drawn from the gate of the SCR switch 86, the SCR switch 86 becomes latched and the electric pulse 96 is generated so that it can flow out of the anode side of the capacitor bank 84, through the SCR switch 86, to the cathode side of the propulsive capacitor 42. In an example, the control current 98 is drawn from the gate of the SCR switch 86 via a triggering circuit loop 100. In an example, the trigger loop 100 includes a control current supply, such as a direct current battery, 102. An advantage of using a silicon-controlled rectifier as the switch is that the amperage that is necessary for the control current to activate or latch the silicon-controlled rectifier and the voltage necessary to generate the control current are both very low compared to the current that can flow through and the voltage that can be applied across the silicon-controlled rectifier. Therefore, even though the voltage across the anode and cathode of the SCR switch 86 corresponding to the electric pulse 96 can be as high as 200 volts or more, the battery, 102, can be as low as a standard 9 volts battery. The trigger loop 100 can also include a firing switch 104 that activates the control current 98 through the trigger loop 100, e.g., so that the control current 98 does not flow until the firing switch 104 is engaged. As shown in Fig. 4, the firing switch 104 is a mechanical device that can move between an open position and a closed position. When the firing switch 104 is in the open position, as is shown in Fig. 4, the trigger loop 100 is an open circuit so that the control current 98 cannot flow. When the firing switch 104 is in the dosed position, the trigger loop 100 becomes a complete, closed circuit so that the control current 98 can flow, and thus can activate the SCR switch 86. In an example, the firing switch 104 is operatively coupled to a mechanical actuator of the weapon 10, such as the firing trigger 18 shown in Figs. 1 and 2, when a user articulates the actuator, e.g., pulls the trigger 18, the firing switch 104 allows the control current 98 to flow from the baton, 102, which then latches the SCR switch 86 so that the electric pulse 96 will be generated by the capacitor bank 84. Another advantage of a silicon-controlled rectifier switch 86 is that the control current 98 need only be drawn from the gate of the SCR switch 86 for long enough for the electric pulse 96 to begin flowing through the SCR switch 86. Once the SCR switch 86 has been latched, the SCR switch 86 will remain latched and able to conduct the electric pulse 96 until the current of the electric pulse 96 falls below a cutoff current, which is lower than the amperage needed for the control current 98 to activate the SCR switch 86 in the first place. Since the electric pulse 96 begins flowing essentially instantaneously after the SCR switch 86 is activated by the control current 98. This means that the control current source, e.g., the battery 102, need only supply the control current 98 for a very short period of time. After that point, the trigger loop 100 can be reopened and the control current 98 can be ceased without cutting off the electric pulse loop 92. In an example, the firing switch 104 is configured so that when a user releases the force on the trigger 18, a biasing force acts on the firing switch 104 so that it will be moved into the open position. In other words, the firing switch 104 is configured to be in the open position by default unless a force is exerted on it to overcome the biasing force and move the switch 104 to the closed position. The capacitor bank charging loop 94 provides an electrical current that is capable of charging the discharge capacitors 82 of the capacitor bank 84, which is also referred to as a charging current 106. In an example, the charging current 106 is designed to have electrical properties e.g., current, voltage, and duration, that is able to charge the discharge capacitors 82 to their lull capacity such that the capacitor bank 84 will be able to generate a new electric pulse 96 to overload a new propulsive capacitor 42. Capacitors such as the discharge capacitors 82 require a DC current as the charging current 106. In an example, the charging loop 94 includes a source 108 for the charging current 106. The charging source 108 can be any device or combination of devices that are capable of generating the charging current 106 as DC current and with specified electrical properties. A specific example of the charging source 108 is described in more detail below. As mentioned above, when the electric pulse 96 is generated by the capacitor bank 84 so that the electric pulse 96 flows through the electric pulse loop 92. The electrons of the electric pulse 96 are discharged from the anode sides of the discharge capacitors 82. In an example, the charging source 108 is configured to supply the charging current 106 into the discharge capacitors 82 in the opposite direction. In other words, in an example, the charging source 108 is configured so that the electrons of the charging current 106 flow into the anode sides rather than out of the anode sides of the discharge capacitors 82, as occurs during discharging of the capacitor bank 84. As the charging current 106 flows into the anode sides of the discharge capacitors 82, electrons flow out of the cathode sides such that the charging current 106 can pass through the remainder of the charging loop 94. In an example, the charging loop 94 also includes a resistor 110 connected in series with the capacitor bank 84, which can limit the amperage of the charging current 106 in order to protect the discharge capacitors 82 and the charging source 108 from an overly high current flow. In particular, the resistor 110 can protect the discharge capacitors 82 during the initial activation of the charging current 106 because at that time the terminal voltage of the discharge capacitors 82 is 0, which can theoretically result in unlimited current through the charging loop 94, which could overload and damage the discharge capacitors 82, the wiring of the charging loop 94, or the components of the charging source 108. The charging loop 94 can also include a charging switch 112 that activates the charging current 106 flow through the charging loop 94. In an example, the charging switch 112 is a mechanical switch that can be moved between an open position and a closed position, similar to the firing switch 104. When the charging switch 112 is in the open position, the charging loop 94 is an open circuit so that the charging current 106 cannot flow. When the charging switch 112 is in the closed position, the charging loop 94 becomes a complete, closed circuit so that the charging current 106 can charge the discharge capacitors 82. In an example, the charging switch 112 is operatively coupled to a second mechanical actuator of the weapon 10 so that a user can control charging of the discharge capacitors 82 of the capacitor bank 84. In an example, the mechanical actuator that initiates charging of the discharge capacitors 82 is a second trigger 114, also referred to as the charging trigger 114, that is separate from the firing trigger 18 described above. When a user articulates the charging trigger 114, the charging switch 112 is moved from the open to the closed position, which causes the charging current.